Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just letting everybody in, so bear with us for a second as we're having a lot of arrivals. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just letting people in. Whilst you're here, could you please introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, the organization or club you're from, and also which county you're in? That just helps us keep track of who's attending. So if you wouldn't mind just popping that in the chat now, and then we'll get going properly shortly. Fantastic. I can see some introductions coming in the chat now, which is excellent. We're still getting a lot of people joining, so bear with us.
Hello.
Oh yeah, it's not letting me enter anything.
Same for myself. I can't add thing to the chat.
So it says the chat is only available during a meeting.
That's the same for me.
Apologies for that. We can hear you, so I'm not sure why that's not working.
And it's not displaying any content either at the moment. I don't know whether it should or not, but
So I'm not sure. I got a notification to say that someone else had muted me. So I wonder if someone has accidentally taken control in the background.
It's all right. I'm just updating the settings because I think I'd muted everybody's mic so that they couldn't physically have their mic on. So I've just undone that. But then I just put some people on mute because they had come in unmuted. So not sure about what's happening with your chat, Andy, because I can see.
Yeah, the mic's working and the camera's now working, but the oh, hang on.
Yeah, just to update on.
It's working now.
You're in. Fab.
Yeah. Just to update on that in terms of I couldn't access the chat. It's James from Get Berkshire Active, and I can now. So hopefully it's working for everyone now.
So yeah, you should all have your access to cameras, mics, and chat. But obviously, feel free to have your cameras on. But if it's okay to keep your mics muted for the moment, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're still getting a lot of people joining, so I won't make a start on the actual presentation just yet. Just for those of you that have just joined us, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves in the chat, and your name, organization or club you come from, and also the county that you're in, so that can help us record where everybody's coming from. That would be much appreciated. Right, dare I say it's slowing down a little bit with the entrances, and would this be a good time to start? I'm sure we'll get lots of people joining us. Continue, so Heidi, if you wouldn't mind just continuing to admit people. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. My name's Callum. I'm the Sport Welfare Officer for Berkshire. I'm joined by my colleagues from Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and Hampshire as well, who hopefully most of you will have spoken to in your counties. just to give you a very brief overview, if anyone wasn't able to attend our introduction forum before Christmas, we are what's called the Sports Welfare Officer Network. So each county has at least one sports welfare officer. In Hampshire, you guys have two. You have a couple there. We basically support the network with safeguarding. We're not there to police anyone. We're there to try and support and add manpower to the active partnership network and also the national governing body network. So thank you very much. We've got a very good turnout tonight, and I can see lots of people still arriving. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the representatives of the NGBs that are here and have clearly advertised this very well. If you have any questions during the presentation, please pop them in the chat, and some of my colleagues will be monitoring that. Don't panic if we don't answer your question instantly. We may have a few small breaks, and we've also got a longer Q&A at the end. So if your question is relevant to what's being discussed, we may interrupt, but if not, please don't worry, we'll get to it at the end. I'm still seeing a lot of people joining, so I'm hesitant to start too quickly. How many have we got now?
So
I've got 53 attendees plus ourselves.
It is being recorded, so if anyone is a bit delayed,
yeah, I'm
we will send
conscious
out
it's 5
the
past, so I
recording.
don't want to run over if people have other things to do. So I think we'll make a start. So yes, thank you very much for joining us, everyone. As I say, I'm Callum. I'm the Sport Welfare Officer for Berkshire, and we've got our colleagues from Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, and Hampshire with us. We've also got Kelly Peters, who is our GDPR expert for this evening, who will be going through all things GDPR. And as I say, there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end, so do pop them in the chat. If you haven't already, please do introduce yourself in the chat with your name, the organisation you're from, and which county you're in. And I will hand over to Kelly now, who will take you through GDPR.
Cool, thank you. Hopefully I can share my screen.
Perfect. I can see your screen, so that's hopeful.
Brilliant. And everyone else can see my screen. Okay, if you can just put the thumbs up or some kind of reaction so I can make sure you can all see it. Cool. Okay. So what I've been asked to do is to provide you with some basics on data protection. Some of you may already be very familiar with the subject, some of you not so much. So I'm coming at it from a very introductory level. Feel free to ask any questions as they might come up. I'm more than happy to answer them. So I'm Kelly Peters. I am the Data Protection Officer for Active Oxfordshire. And let's talk about all things GDPR. I'm not going to, I do get super excited by this subject, so hopefully that will come across in the presentation. And I've made it a little animated, if not for anyone's entertainment other than myself, because, you know, for some, it might not be as exciting a subject as it is for me. So what I want for you to get out of this evening's session is to gain an understanding of the GDPR definitions and why they are important. To gain an understanding of the principles as they are set out in data protection law and how they apply to you and your clubs, and the real importance of maintaining integrity and security of the data that you are processing. So before I start off, I always like to give a bit of a history of data protection, because for some it feels like it's a relatively new subject, and it's really not. So we in the UK have had data protection legislation since the 1980s. It was and always has been about the free movement of data. Certainly when we were part of Europe, it was about the free movement of data across borders in Europe and understanding transfers to the wider world. Before the GDPR, the General Data Protection and Regulation in 2018, we have the Data Protection Act of 1998. And I'm going to show my age here. So the most sophisticated thing I could do in 1998 was play Snake on my Nokia mobile phone, make a phone call, or send a text message. In the early 2000s, we had the introduction of social media platforms such as Facebook. We had Google and search engines. We had 3G licenses being issued. So technology significantly evolved from the 2000s to the point that we are now in 2028, 2018, and the law wasn't sufficient for the technology and the types of data that we were processing. So here came the Data Protection Act of 2018, which is what we have in the UK, as well as the GDPR. So if anyone asks you, we have two pieces of legislation in the UK. We have the General Data Protection Regulation, which is identical to all of it, the European counterparts. And we have the Data Protection Act of 2018. The reason we have the Data Protection Act of 2018 is because it allows us to have certain UK-specific exemptions that we can rely on. So they do work collectively together. It's been in force since 2018, and you may recall that there was lots of hype about making sure you had appropriate consent, that there will be lots of huge fines. And in actual fact, in the course of the last 6 years, our commissioner has issued all of 6 fines. So financial penalties should not be and never have been the driver for data protection. It really should be about making sure we understand what we collect, why we collect, and how we collect it, and that we do that securely. With a new government, they have introduced into Lords the proposal for the Data Use and Access Bill, which is currently going through legislation and may come into force at some point this year. But that will entirely depend on how much debate there is about the legislation. So watch this space, data protection might change. It still applies, even though we've left Europe, we still very much have data protection legislation in this country. Okay, so what do I mean, or what does the law mean even, when we talk about personal data? Personal data is anything that identifies me or you, either directly or indirectly. So what do I mean by that? My name, Kelly Peters, directly identifies who I am. My job title as Data Protection Officer of Active Oxfordshire is quite unique because I am the only Data Protection Officer at Active Oxfordshire. So even without knowing my name, you could contact Heidi and say, Heidi, I'd really like to speak to your Data Protection Officer. And Heidi would know to forward an email to me because she knows I am the DPO. So indirectly, because I have a unique job title, I'm identifiable. Some people's social media handles are unique. Home postal address is also classed as a way that we can identify individuals. Something that's really important to stress is that over a significant number of years of working in this field, opinions that are expressed about individuals that relate to them are their personal data. So I'll give you an example. You might say to Callum or to Heidi or to Sarah, Kelly was truly an atrocious trainer. We thought she was terrible. No, the content was irrelevant. And you're perfectly entitled to express that opinion about me. But I'm also entitled to have a copy of that opinion if I feel that they might have been expressed. So if you're prepared to stand by an opinion, pull it into writing, pull it into a chat message, pull it into a group WhatsApp message if you're on business devices. But if you're not prepared to stand by that, please don't put it into writing or into any kind of recording, because individuals do have the right to access that information. Any kind of identification information that you might be holding. So if you have to do ID checks, whether it be to appoint volunteers or to do DBS checks. I mean, in fact, you might just be sending people a link to a DBS check. But if you're using this, you are processing data, images. So today, for example, we're actually recording my screen with the presentation on it. But if the focus of the recording was the screen that's got all of our images on it, I would be recording if you had your camera turned on, your image, and if we had microphones turned on and you asked a question, we'd also be recording your voice. So where we do capture images, whether they be a headshot, a photo of kids on a pitch playing a game, or adults, for example, or you simply have headshots, or you've got video recordings, or you record something like today, be mindful that you are processing personal data. If you have at your club CCTV in operation, and even though it's there for the prevention and detection of crime, if it's capturing images of individuals, it is you're processing personal data. I've already talked about job title. Obviously, audio is also voice. So, you know, you're likely to be processing a lot of information. So what categories? So the law talks about categories of personal data. So you might have financial information. So you might have bank account details. You might take credit card payment details. You might have payment history for members. You might have professional details of individuals volunteering for you, working for you, or even becoming members. You might have some form of communication data, whether it be emails, it might be work SMS messages, you might have Teams chat, Google chat. So there might be various vehicles by which you might share messaging that might contain personal data. Anything that's in italics is a special category of data, so it's the more sensitive information. So public data, you might have someone's marital status. You might, unlikely, but you might want to collect political affiliations. You might have demographic information about age. You might have income bracket. You could have behavioural activities in terms of how people interact with your websites. For example, you may have medical and health information about people that work for you or volunteer for you. You might have accident information for any accidents that take place at the club. And if you are processing any medical or health information, it is sensitive information, and you do need to have a very clear reason for holding that data. You may or may not, and again, it is special category, but you might have gender identity and sexual orientation if it's relevant. You might have identity such as usernames and passwords to access any club systems. And like I've already covered, you might have insurance, national insurance details, or driving license and video and ID. And again, you might collect ethnicity, but the law does ask you to think about whether or not you can collect this anonymously. So from an ethnicity perspective, do you actually need to have it attached to an identified person's name? Can you actually collect it anonymously? So if you can, do collect an ethnicity data, but think about whether or not you can minimize what you're processing. So you might collect a lot of information. You might collect email addresses, contact people details, bank details, and that, but you should know what you're processing. So one of the actions I would ask you to consider taking away, if you haven't already done it, is really understand the different types of personal data that you're collecting and the different types of individuals you're collecting it on. So what do I mean? Visitors to your websites, potential members, current members, employees, volunteers. You'll have different types of individuals, and each of those different types of individuals, you'll have different types of data that you're processing. So think about the people and the types of data that you're processing, and then think about how you're processing it. So the law defines what processing. So it is disclosing something by transmission. So if you're sharing information with a third party, so maybe you have to disclose details about a safeguarding issue to the council, for example, you'll be disclosing that via transmission, via an email, for example. You'll be storing information, whether it be on your computer, a cloud system such as Microsoft Office 365, or you might already have your own kind of database. The decision to delete information, so people that are no longer part of your clubs, you deciding to delete that data, that is a processing action. Whether you analyze it, you make decisions to record information like today's training session. The fact that you use data to make a decision, so to recruit a new volunteer, you might need to have their contact details, their experience, their skills, for example. So you'll need certain amounts of data about an individual to use to be able to make a decision about whether or not you're going to appoint them into that position. And the most common view of processing is that collecting it. So whether it be an online form, a paper form, a document, an Excel spreadsheet, you will be collecting data. And you may also make decisions about restricting data. So certain information that you process as a club might be more sensitive than others, and you might want to restrict who has access to that. So processing, quite a lot of to cover on that. I want to ask, because I want to give myself a 2-second break. Are there any quick questions anyone has on personal data or the definitions of processing that I've already covered? Okay. I'm also very cool with everyone being quiet. So we have what is called 2 different types of or not organizations, entities. So we have a data controller and a data processor, and all of you in all of your clubs will act as a role, not you as individuals, but your club will be a data controller. But you might also, as a club, outsource certain activities or systems to third parties. And those third parties are classed as data processors. And I want to just describe what the difference is between those 2 roles. So a data controller is the organization or sole trader who decides the purpose. So why do you need the data that you're collecting, and how do you intend to use it? So are you storing it, collecting it, disseminating that? So what's your purpose, and how do you intend to use it? Where do you intend to store it? How long do you intend to retain it for? And who do you intend to share it with, for example? So all of your clubs will be data controllers. So the example here, a club has decided that it wants to disseminate a monthly electronic newsletter to all current and potential members. So you're deciding that you need an electronic newsletter. You need to have people's names and email addresses to be able to personalize that message. You want to do it in an electronic format because it'll be much easier for you to manage that experience. So as a data controller, you're making that decision. You've also realized that actually you don't want to send this out via Microsoft Outlook. You want to use an online cloud-based email marketing tool because it's easy. It allows you to manage all of your unsubscribes, and it allows you to create some really funky templates. So that cloud-based email marketing platform is what is called a data processor, because you are outsourcing that activity to a third party for you to upload your contact details to that platform, for you to create your content, and for them then to disseminate that on your behalf and manage all of the unsubscribes, manage the who's clicked what and level of engagement. So your decision to use MailChimp in this example is MailChimp is the data processor. Now, your responsibility as a data controller is to make sure that you're comfortable with the level of compliance that organization has. It's not enough that because other clubs around you are using that platform that your answer is everyone else is using this. You have to do your own level of due diligence on that third party, because you as a data controller have to risk assess any organization who's you might be sharing data with that they are going to process on your behalf, such as a shredding company, a payroll company, accountancy firm, if they're managing any data on your behalf. So all of you are going to be data controllers, and you will likely have a list of data processors. So what are your responsibilities as a club under the law? You will be determining the purposes. So we'll talk about why you have to be transparent about that, but you will be determining the purposes for processing. you'll have to make sure that you inform data subjects of why you collect their data, how you intend to use it, how you intend to share it. You'll also be responsible for letting them know if there are any data breaches that involve their data, which might put them at high risk of fraudulent activity or physical harm or emotional distress. You'll also be responsible for fulfilling any of their subject rights, so the right to access, for example. You'll be responsible for notifying the Information Commissioner should there be a data breach that is a risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. You'll be responsible for issuing contracts or making sure that if a data processor issues you with a contract, you've read all the terms and your understanding of the level of compliance that that third party has when it comes to data protection. And you'll be responsible for doing due diligence, both pre and post appointment of a software vendor, or, you know, a one-man band who's acting as your outsourced HR support or finance support, for example. So you do have responsibilities as a controller to make sure that you have risk assessed what you're processing, why you're processing, and that you have it documented.
Kelly,
And I'm going to, yeah.
Sorry, I felt like you were coming to a natural pause just
Yeah,
for a
yeah.
moment there. It was just, we've got a question in the chat from Tanya.
Yeah, go for it.
And obviously it leads on to what you were just talking about. So she's just asked, so you mean to check if they will share the information you are uploading to their sites for a mail shot? Tanya, did you want to just elaborate on that a little bit more so we can understand?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just saying, so if I was uploading, say, to MailChimp with all the email addresses that I have collected from my football club,
Yep.
Is it then to check that they won't then use those email addresses to spam other information? Is that what you mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, but you'll also want to check that that you feel that they're safe and secure. So that, you know, have they had any security issues? You know, so have you seen them in the press recently for doing anything dodgy with data? What, you know, do they fill you with confidence when you look at their website and they pass you to a GDPR page that says these are all the security measures we have in place? If they're like GDPR what? I'd be like, maybe I don't want to use them. But yeah, you want to check that they're definitely not going to spam people, because that will infuriate a lot of individuals.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay.
Nothing else in the chat, so I think we're good to continue.
Cool. So the first principle of the law is that we need to be fair, lawful, and transparent. So for every purpose that you have for processing data, you have to have a legal basis for processing that data. You must be clear that you're not going to deceive people. So if you only need information to start a membership with them, then you shouldn't be doing something different with that data. So the example that Tanya just gave about uploading data to a MailChimp and then selling the data, that would be MailChimp being unfair and inappropriate using of that data, because they don't have any permission and they don't have any lawful basis. So we need to make sure that we're being fair in our processing, and we must be transparent. So we must be able to explain to people why we process their information. And if you can't explain why you have their information, question whether or not you should have the information. And the bases that we have are consent, legal obligation, whether it's in the club's interest and the individual's interest, known as a legitimate interest. Do you have a contract with the individual? Is it a public task? So are you performing your activities on behalf of the council, for example, like a general election, or you're running the polling stations, for example? Or is it vital interest in that it's a life or death situation? Typically, emergency services will rely on vital interests. So very quickly, let me go through the legal bases and then we'll flick on to a few more things, because I want to make sure there's time for questions. So if you're relying on consent to process any of your data, it must be freely given. So it cannot be attached to a condition. So it cannot be, we will give you access to a particular resource if you give us our consent. That's not valid consent, and it's not freely given. It must require a positive action. So whether you're asking someone to put their email address in and press submit, whether you're asking them to tick a box to say, I opt in to this. And there must be a clear purpose. So you must be able to explain to people, by giving me your email address, you are agreeing to us sending you a regular monthly newsletter. Do you agree? Tick yes. And if you think that consent might be difficult, then it won't be the appropriate legal basis for you to rely on, and you might need to consider an alternative. So some top tips: don't use pre-ticked boxes. You are responsible for maintaining records of consents. So if you're relying on consent, whether it be photo consent, consent for cookies on your website, there must be some audit trail of when that consent was given, who gave that consent. And remember that they always have the option to object to that. So they have the right to say, I no longer consent to you processing my data, please stop. So as easy as it was to give consent, it must be that easy to revoke the consent. And like I said, don't make it a precondition of service. You will have legal obligations. So you will have health and safety requirements, and I'm sure there will be other legal requirements that you as clubs have to fulfill. So where it's necessary for a legal obligation, you must know what the legal instrument is. And by that, I mean, what law are you relying on to collect data? So the Health and Safety Act, there will be requirements in terms of what to collect if there is an accident. So you'll be capturing information for that purpose. And some examples are employer disclosing salary details to the HMRC, called in an accident of a volunteer, confirming a successful applicant has the right to work in the UK, disclosing details to authorities about any fraudulent or criminal activity. So think about the purposes that you have that are required by law for you to fulfill your duties. Document your decision. So list the different purposes that you have where they are associated with a legal obligation. So here I've got the Limitations Act of 1980, and ensure that your privacy notices, wherever they be on your website, whether you have a document that you send to new members or to volunteers, that you're very clear that these are the purposes where you're relying on a legal obligation and what that obligation is. Where you are relying on a legitimate interest, and whilst this is the most flexible, this is not your get out of jail card. It must be a genuine interest of you as a club and that of the individual. So the exchange of data must be in both parties' interest, and it must be equal. So avoid using legitimate interests if people don't understand why it would be beneficial to them for you to have their data. And if it is hard and you haven't been able to justify that balance, legitimate interest is unlikely to be your legal basis. If you're a new club post 2018 and you've introduced new legitimate interests, so I'll give you an example. If I was to meet you at a networking event because you wanted to promote your club to other business groups, you might share your business card with me for me to follow up that conversation. Now, I'm interested in understanding about your club and maybe sponsoring it, for example. That exchange of business cards and that follow-up is very much a legitimate interest in both parties' behaviour. So you're able to continue to rely on a legitimate interest. If today you come up with a new purpose, a new justification for needing data, and you think legitimate interest is going to be your best option, you have to do an assessment. You have to be clear that the purpose is necessary, that it is a balance between you and the individual, and that there isn't any other alternative basis for you to be relying on. Make sure that individuals reasonably expect you to use their data in that way. So, an unreasonable expectation would be scraping people's data off the internet and spamming them, for example. And very much like consent is opt-in and people have the option to opt out, if you are relying on legitimate interest, people will always have the option to opt out of that. They have the option to say, I don't want to receive this opportunity to sponsor you as a club, for example. And if it's a contract, the contract is between you, the club, and the individual. So some of your membership, if you're asking for payment, you might have terms and conditions that club members sign up to. And that will be a contract. So as part of that contract, you might have specific pieces of data that you want to process: name, email address, postal address, transaction details. And there might be some preconditions as part of that. So it is to deliver a contractual service, whether it be to issue them with a quote or to actually to deliver that service. And as an example of preconditions, think about Netflix or Amazon Prime, for example. If you want to get access to a 14-day free trial, they require you to give you bank details or a credit card that they won't charge until 14 days comes to an end, at which point they say they will charge you unless you stop the free trial. So that's a precondition of access. So some of your processing will be potentially contractually driven. So what do we mean by fair, lawful and transparent? So here's what you should have in your privacy notices, whether they be on your website or elsewhere. You must explain to the individual that's reading that who you are. So what is your club name? Who and how do I reach out to you? What are your contact details? Why do you have my data? How do you intend to use it? Do you intend to share my information? So is it with cloud-based software solutions? Is it with other active partnerships? What's the length of time you're going to hold my data for? So what are those retention periods? How easy is it for me to remove my consent? So, who do I need to contact, or what button do I need to press to remove my consent? If you have a data protection officer, who are they? How do I reach out to them? If you're using legitimate interest to process my data, what are those legitimate interests? So is it for the prevention and detection of crime, which is why you have CCTV? Is it to follow up on any inquiries that someone's made about joining your club? Where do you store my data? Is it just in the UK? Is it in Europe? Is it further afield? If it's further afield, how safe is my data in that international country? What are my rights? So I have the right to access. I have the right to have accurate data. I have the right to withdraw my consent, for example. So list what an individual's rights are and how I can actually ask them to be taken into consideration. How can I complain? So if I'm unhappy with how you're processing my data, how do I complain either to you or to the Information Commissioner? So my top tips are: use plain language. If you are working with children, or, target your privacy policy to be friendly to children. Test it. So if you have members, if you have committee groups, send out your privacy notice, see if they understand it. If not, change the language. Review it on an annual basis, because some of your processes may have changed, some of your systems may have changed. Like I said, write it in a child-friendly way, and different audiences, it might be easier to provide different privacy notices. And an example is the Active Oxfordshire notice. Okay. So for CCTV, you'll need to reference both on the privacy policy on your website that you use CCTV, and on the signs on your where your CCTV is in and around the club. There needs to be a sign to say there is CCTV in operation, and then to provide them with a link of how they can read the privacy policy. So as long as they're aware that CCTV is in operation, they have the option to read the privacy notice on a website, then you've fulfilled your transparency elements.
Can I just one other thing there? It's come through on the Q&A section, which I didn't actually even know it was there. So thanks, Lisa, for your message. I can see that's come through. So Lisa's just asked, can you recommend some practical, acceptable collection and storage options for the following scenarios? I don't know if you want me to just pop these in the chat or if you can see them in the Q&A there, Helly, and we can perhaps look at this at the end of the presentation.
Yeah, I can't see them at the moment. I think that's primarily because I got my slide deck. Okay, what I can do is, because I probably need to give these some consideration, is it okay if I provide you with a response, typed it up, and then for you to send this back to the group in terms of answering these questions? Would that be acceptable to everybody?
That's fine. There was just one other question about anything regarding social media. Is there anything age related to consider in terms of names, images, and tags? Again, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and I do have an element on imagery. So for imagery, you really want to make sure that you have the appropriate consents in place with whether it be an adult or whether it be a child. So firstly, make sure that you've got consents, but make sure you're very clear about the different types of imagery and your use of that imagery. So it might just be on social media platforms. You might want to use them as case studies, for example. So it's a more deeper dive, but you want to share them on your website. You might have a publication, for example. So in your consent forms, be clear about what you're collecting and why you're collecting it. I would, as a way of being able to easily find imagery, I would have a naming convention for each of your images, but I'd also have retention periods. So be clear about how long you're going to be retaining imagery. And the only other thing I would ask you to consider is that where you potentially might have, you're working with children and you might have vulnerable children, for example, you might have to be conscious about where you can take photos of them. So if you let me think. So an example might be you've got children that are being adopted, for example, or you might have children that are at risk and they've been asked that there'll be no photos. So there must be a way in which that you can identify those children who shouldn't have their pictures promoted and stuff. So have a policy, have a form that captures the consent, and make sure that any of the photography and videographers that are working on your behalf are aware of those individuals who shouldn't be captured if it's, face to face. If it's group shots, typically that's easier to manage. Hopefully that's answered the question. If not, I'll come back to it after the fact. So I'm conscious that it's 22, so let me talk about maintaining records, but then obviously do interrupt me if there's anything else. So accurate records are really important. So let me give you an example. My younger sister is 10 years younger than me, and the GP practice keeps sending her letters for screening for someone that is 20 years older than her actual age. So somewhere in their system, they have the wrong age for my sister, even though they have her date of birth. And they are now sending her inaccurate information, which she's incredibly frustrated about, which to me shows really poor records management on behalf of the GP practice. So we've asked them to correct it and obviously pointed out how they can improve that. But you might also get frustrated by the fact that you might get posts to your address for previous recipients, even if you've told people that they no longer live there. So inaccurate records cause a lot of frustration. So my challenge to you and what the data protection asks you to consider is, if you've been told that information is inaccurate, like inaccurate postal addresses, or someone's changed their email address, or they've changed their name because they've got married, they've got divorced, for example, have a process in place to update your records. Typically, records should be updated as soon as you've been notified. Now, that might not be practical, but certainly make sure within a month that you've updated any records. So if people move, have a process in place where you can update records, but also proactively think about on an annual basis, is there anything that you can send out to your members or to people that you work with that say, do we still have the correct details for you if it's contact detail related? So accuracy matters. Make sure that you've got a process in place to address that. Email bounce backs are a good example that you might have typed in an email address wrong. So double check that. And in the news, in May of last year, there was a water parasite issue. Southwest Water told everybody they could turn back their water on. However, they poorly mapped that out, and actually a number of homes were told incorrectly to turn back their water, even though they were still at risk, because they had inaccurate information. It still put those individuals at risk, and they were offered a £75 of compensation. So it does matter, and it does hit the press. From a retention perspective, you cannot keep data forever, but you can determine retention periods. So for all of the different purposes you have, think about the different retention periods. If you're legally required to capture data, the law will tell you your retention periods. If you're not relying on a legal obligation, you determine what is appropriate and reasonable for a retention period. You might feel quite overwhelmed by that, but what we want to make sure is that you don't delete information too soon, because you need to make sure you cover yourself from a liabilities perspective, but you also don't keep data too long. So if it were to be part of a data breach, someone comes back to you and says, why do you still have my data after this amount of time? So from today's session, I would ask you to go back and look at your retention, and do you have a retention schedule? If you don't, how do you create a retention schedule? So think about your different purposes, think about why you're having that information, and then what is the requirement for keeping that data? And always think about reasonableness. Is it reasonable for us to still have access to this information? And if anyone's interested, or would like, I've got some example retention periods that are typical, so I can send to Heidi examples of what retention looks like if anyone doesn't have that. And obviously, when you no longer need it, data should either be destroyed, whether it be shredded, and I'm talking about confetti style shredded, not just chucked into your recycle bin at home, or deleted from your system. So delete. Don't just delete it and it sits in your trash can. It must be deleted from all systems. So delete data, archive it if it's needed, but you don't need it immediate access to it. Make sure that any third parties that you're working with can delete your data. There's nothing more frustrating than going with a cloud-based provider who then tell you they can't delete your data. Use cross-threaders, and if you are outsourcing any of your activities in terms of destroying data, get a certificate of destruction, because you want evidence they've actually done their job. Okay, I'll rattle through these and then we can go on to questions. So from a security perspective, the law requires you to have appropriate technical and organizational measures. So appropriateness is based on the type of data you're processing. So you don't have to have, the platinum standard of everything, but you do need to have a standard that protects to the best of your ability the data that you're processing. So malware protection should be installed on all devices. You should have had encryption turned on the devices that you use, whether it be laptops or PCs. So there must be some kind of disk encryption, and any software platforms you're using should enable you with that option to encrypt. You should have policy. So there should be a data protection policy that staff and volunteers can follow. There should be procedures in terms of what to handle if there is a breach, how to respond to an individual if they have a concern about their data. Please make sure you back up your data. The information that you have is critical to the lifeblood of your organizations. Don't assume it's being backed up by a software vendor. Ask, do they back it up? And if they don't, put processes in place to back your data up, and then test that backup. Always remember, from a security perspective, typical number of breaches are via email. So if you can use blind copy rather than CC, it's going to save you a whole lot of problems. So put people in a BCC rather than a CC. Delete emails when they're no longer required. I've far too often see people with emails that are just unnecessarily stored in their email account. So maybe add it into your retention policy. And if you have a sensitive email that you need to send, most email platforms allow you to have an option to encrypt one-off email, so you're protecting it. So only the person that receives it at the other end is able to open that email. And please, any documents that you receive into your email inbox, store it somewhere else. So store the attachment in a secure folder somewhere, because email has never been designed to be a storage system, even though that's in effect what it became. I'm going to skip the data sharing disasters. Just be mindful of the conversations that you have in public areas. I don't know about you, but I have heard one too many confidential conversations in public spaces, whether they be on trains, on buses, and in cafes. And I'm like, should you really be conducting an interview in Starbucks? Should you really be giving me your insurance details whilst everyone else in the train carriage is listening to you talk to your insurance agent? It's just not appropriate. So always give someone the option to phone them back to say, I'm not in a place where I can have this conversation. Have robust passwords. Password 123456 is the most common password in breach files. So avoid using predictable passwords. Follow the National Cybersecurity Centre guidance in using 3 random words. And if that's too complex for you, use at least a password that contains uppercase, lowercase numbers, and special characters. And please, I beg of you, do not use the same password for all of your platforms. And when you change it, don't just change the last digit. So, like I said, don't share it. Don't put it on Post-it notes either. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes. It's not 15, but there is 10 minutes now for questions. So I'm done.
Do you want me to run through?
Yeah, go for it.
And like I think we said at the start of the presentation, thank you so much, Kelly. That's a lot of information to take in. And any questions that we can't perhaps deal with now, we'll summarize and send out on the email to you. I just wanted to clarify, Kelly, are we sending the slides out with the recording? Or
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, fab.
Yep.
So people will get a copy of the slides as well. So I think sort of a question that's come in that a few other people have asked similarly around, is the retention schedule the same as data retention policy? And is there an example of a time frame of data retention, please?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. So a data retention policy will have a schedule in it. So the retention policy will set out, this is how we approach retention. This is the decisions that we make in terms of, is something now ready for a decision to retain or delete? And then the schedule is typically a table that sets out the different retention periods and who owns that retention. But I'm more than happy to send out an example retention policy and what a retention schedule can look like. But just bear in mind that you will need to go back and double check that some of the dates and times might need to be different for you. But I'm more than happy to send that out to people.
Okay, great. Then we've got a message from Dean regarding next of kin's details. Do you have somewhere you would suggest storing these?
So it entirely depends on the system that you have. So for example, if you have Office 365, for example, your license might include SharePoint. So I might create a folder specifically for members or next of kin, depending on who the next of kin's related to. Store all my information in that folder and restrict access to only maybe 1 or 2 members of the club on a need to know basis. Alternatively, there are online systems out there that allow you to capture next of kin information along with other details about members. But if you are limited on budget, then I would look at your existing provider of email, whether it be Google or Microsoft, for example, and see if they have an option for you to create an online cloud-based storage structure where you can store the details in there and then restrict who has access to it. So it's safe, it's secure, but you've also got an element of confidence that it's being backed up as well. Hopefully that makes sense.
And then that kind of perhaps links into Lisa's question around an example of a secure storage folder for email attachments. Would that be a sort of like similar answer, do you think?
Yeah. So, for example, when I get documents sent to me, and I get documents sent to me a lot, whether it be via Teams or via email, for example, I will, if it's in relation to a particular incident, so if it's relation to data breaches, for example, I will have a folder on my OneDrive, and I'll also have a folder on my SharePoint folder that will say data breaches, and then I will download that document from my email and I'll add it into that folder, and then I will delete the attachment from the email. Hopefully that makes sense and isn't overly complex.
Thank you. We've got a question here from Christian, and also Tanya's mentioned it as well. They use a company called Pachiro.com to host and design their website, and also use them for putting out their comms to parents and volunteers over 18. They've got their own GDPR policy, but it's quite generic. So should they, as a club, provide their own specific one?
Yes. So if they are providing you with a template document, which is great because I think that's a good start for 10, you will need to modify that to reflect what you're collecting via that website. So if you've embedded a collection form, for example, you'll be determining the purposes for that. So definitely personalize the privacy policy to your own club. And in the slide, which you'll get the slide deck, those points in terms of what it should be covered, use that as a way to make sure that the privacy policy is then fit for purpose. Hopefully that makes sense.
That's great. Thanks, Kelly. So I think that's all the questions. All I would say is that obviously regarding timeframes at the moment, if anyone has got any questions post session today, just ping it over to one of us that you've got our email addresses for, and we can pitch that to Kelly and then hopefully get you an answer. But I will hand back to Callum. I think we're perhaps all done.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my final slides. I'm hoping everyone can see the final slide now. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you everyone for attending. Hopefully you found it useful. Really great to see so many people on the call, and hopefully we were able to answer as many questions as possible. I appreciate that. Oh, sorry, we're getting some people saying they can't see the slides, but I'm getting a lot of people saying they can see the slides. So I'm not quite sure why that is happening. So I think we're going to send the slides out with the post presentation follow-up anyway. It's really just the last few slides that show a bit of information. So we'll send those out in an email afterwards. I think that's the plan anyway. It's really just got the details of each sport welfare officer for each county. So please do follow up with that. We also have a post-event feedback survey, which is accessible via the QR code on the screen now, which I believe most of you can see. So apologies if you can't see that. Yes, good idea putting things in the chat, Heidi. Thank you for that. That's the magic of background support. So if you can't do that, if you can't see the screen, we'll put the relevant information in the chat. And finally, just before we go, if you're thinking that was great, I don't want it to be over. Well, the good news is we have an online safety forum in 2 weeks' time. I think it's also Monday evening at 6 till 7, if I remember correctly. 3rd of February, which will cover online safety. So probably more around things like use of social media and things like that. I will now put the link to that in the chat so that people who can't see the slides can also get that. Just bear with me one moment. Right. So we will send that out as well to all the NGBs and things again, like we did for this one. But if you want to book on straight away, please follow the link now and you can register for that. Similarly, please do provide feedback if you want any other topics covered. This forum came about based on other people's feedback. They wanted support with GDPR. So we're here to listen, and if we can support with specific subjects when people request, we will certainly do that. Obviously, we're not experts in every subject, hence why we get the experts in to join us. I think that's everything from us. I will sort of hang around for a couple of minutes now, and I suspect my colleagues will as well, just in case anyone needs to ask anything urgently. If not, we're all available on email. And thank you very much for giving up some of your evening, and hopefully it was helpful. And thank you, Kelly, for all your information. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice evening.
You too. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Heidi. Take care, everyone.
Bye, all.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Heidi, sorry, it's Paula here from Wantage Town Football Club. We haven't met before. I wonder if we could have a catch up at some stage, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have my email address, Paula?
I do. Well, once I get the slides, I will do so, or it might be on the invite as well. So yeah, would that be all right? So
absolutely.
Even though we're Berks and Bucks FA, we are in Oxfordshire. So would we be one of yours, or would we be Berkshire?
We can do both, because Callum, who's my colleague, and Yvette, who's my colleague, who sit in Berks and Bucks active partnerships, we work together very closely. So
sure.
I put my email address in the chat, so if you want to ping me over an email, we can have a conversation and see what it is that I can help you with, and then if I need to get Callum or Yvette involved, then definitely.
Sure. Okay, I just really wanted to introduce ourselves, and also we're just to let you know we've just got funding for a 3G pitch at the football club, and obviously we're looking for community, more community usage. So I don't know whether that ties in with some of your objectives as well as ours. So as I say, so that was really the essence of the conversation.
No, that's fine. Just pop me over an email, and we will. Yeah, we can link up.
There.
Yeah,
brilliant. Thank you very much. All right, and thanks for the presentation. It was really useful. Thank you.
I think we all want a 3G pitch.
So Heidi, if you can let me know what the questions were, if I've missed any, then I will give you a proper response. But I've got the actions to give you a retention policy, a template retention policy and schedule. And if there's anything else in that, let me know.